All right, today we will be covering our last couple chapters of Isaac Newton, starting off with chapter 11, Becoming a Legend. So, just kind of to recap, this is right after Isaac Newton published his book, which really laid the foundation for modern physics. We could call that book either the English title, which is Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, or the Latin title, which would be Principia. So that book caused quite a sensation. People loved the book, and it made Isaac Newton very famous. So that's where we pick up today with chapter 11, Becoming a Legend. After his book came out, Newton became famous. One student of Cambridge even said, "We gazed on him as someone divine, almost like we looked at him no longer as a human, but almost godlike, almost as if he had character qualities that go beyond just being human." That would be kind of what divine means. Then, unfortunately, in 1693, Newton had a mental breakdown. He went a little bit psycho, either from the stress, the pressure. We obviously know he didn't take great care of himself. Who knows how much sleep he had been getting. But whatever the case, he couldn't eat or sleep, and he wrote his friends some weird letters. The book even talks about he said things like he wanted them to die, or they wanted him to die, or something like that. I can't remember at this point, but also that they were trying to get him in trouble with women and a bunch of crazy kind of psychotic things. Now, when he recovered from the breakdown, he decided that he needed a change. Maybe it was time to take a break from science for a little while, and kind of give himself a little bit of a reset. So, in 1696, some powerful friends of his helped him to get a job at the Royal Mint. Now, this is not mint as in like a place that makes mint flavored candy or mint flavored gum or anything like that, but a mint is typically a building or a machine or a factory where money is made, both metal coins for money as well as paper bills. So, this is where Newton went to work. The Mint was the place that created all of England's coins. For England, it was located in the Tower of London, at least for the city of London, it seems. And when he got the job, his friends, who had not really known Isaac to be much of a hands-on, sweaty, back-breaking work kind of laborer, but I mean, think about even in the beginning of the book when he talks about his attempt at farming, it didn't really go so well. So they fully expected him to not do the work himself, but to hire someone else to do the job for him. But instead, Newton himself actually threw himself into the job and began to work very hard. Now, Newton joined the Mint right at the time of the Great Recoinage of 1696. And so here's what that was about. For years, people had been creating counterfeit or fake coins from bits of silver they clipped off of the edges. So let me see if I can get my pen here. Okay, so if this is the coin, okay, these counterfeiters, let me change the color, would come along and they would clip off the edges. So they would maybe snip off this little bit, 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 and all the way around the edges. Okay. So at a moment's glance, the coins looked almost, I mean, they would obviously melt them down into like a circle and make them look better than I did, but that's just to kind of give you an idea. But at a moment's glance, the coins didn't look much different from a regular coin. So when using them for, transactions, maybe if, for example, if they were shopping for groceries or paying for cloth or trading goods at the market, obviously they were trying to do them pretty quickly so they could move on to the next person, as fast as possible. So they would see these coins and thought, oh, those look pretty normal. But really, in reality, those coins were actually smaller than what they were before. Now, after you've cut off the edges of, hundreds and hundreds of coins, you have quite a bit of scrap metal. And what they would do is they would melt the scraps down into obviously just liquid metal, and then they would make new coins out of those, out of the edges. So where they had, maybe 100 coins before, now they have 150 coins or 120 coins. When they haven't earned any more money, they just made more out of the money that they had. So as a result, the money was now worth much less than it should be. So England decided to make new coins with ridges on the edges, kind of like our quarters in America. And it was Newton's job to oversee the entire process. So I have a picture here of what the new coins looked like. You can see along the outer edges how they have kind of those bumps or ridges. So that would allow the bankers, cashiers, workers, everyone to quickly be able to tell whether or not a coin was real or fake. So the problem is, though, you can't just, collect all the old coins one day and then release all the new coins. It was a process. Gradually, they began to kind of phase out the old smooth-edged coins and introduce the ridged coins. And it worked, and it was Newton's job to oversee that entire process. He did such a good job with this that he was promoted to Master of the Mint in 1699, and he stayed in that position for almost 30 years up until he died. So after he finished the great recoinage and got all the old coins gone, the new coins made, he turned his attention to catching the criminals or catching the counterfeiters instead. His greatest triumph was the capture of a clever counterfeiter named Chaloner. So seemed to be a pretty renowned criminal as far as making fake money goes. Now, while working at the Mint, obviously this was located in London, like we said, but at the same time, the Royal Society was also located in London. And now, we know at this point that Newton didn't have the best relationship with the Royal Society. So while during his first few years in London, Newton kept his distance from the Royal Society, trying to avoid any kind of fights. But in 1703, the president of the Royal Society died, and so did Robert Hooke, who was Newton's old enemy. Now, I do want to point out in the notes, as well as the slide that we're looking at here, when I made this, I think I misread the book. The president of the Royal Society was not Robert Hooke at the time, but the president died as well as Robert Hooke. But in either case, Hooke was gone, and Newton was immediately elected to replace the old president of the Royal Society. A year later, in 1704, Newton published his book on optics. Now, if you're familiar with the term optical illusion or the study of optometry, then you know that a book on optics would have to do with studying the eyes or vision or sight. Now, the reason why he waited so long to publish this, he said, to avoid being engaged in disputes or arguments about these matters, I have hitherto delayed the printing. Basically, he meant that he had waited until Hooke was dead. Because in the past, whenever Newton seemed to release a book or some kind of new idea, Robert Hooke found some way to either cause problems or get upset or claim that Newton had stolen his ideas. And so, just to avoid all of that, Newton waited until he was gone to publish his book on optics. Chapter 12, Battles at the Royal Society. Now that Newton was the president of the Royal Society, he ruled it like a tyrant. He was very strict, made a lot of rules, and pretty much thought he was in total control. Now, this led to a lot of fights, such as the fight over who really invented calculus. So here's what happened. Newton came up with his method of fluxions, right? That was what he called calculus, around 1665, but he never published it until 1704, about 40 years later or so. In 1675, a mathematician named Gottfried Leibniz, had come up with a similar system, but he published his book in 1684. That's 20 years before Newton did. So the problem was, according to the world, the first person that told them about calculus was Gottfried Leibniz, because his book came out in 1684. Circle that. Ooh, that was supposed to circle that, but it did not work. Let me try this again. Gottfried Leibniz's book came out in 1684, but Newton's book didn't come out until 1704. So according to the world, Gottfried Leibniz was the one who first explained to them this method of fluxions or this idea of calculus. But according to Newton, according to his documentation, he had actually thought up his method of fluxions about 10 years or so before Gottfried Leibniz. So it became this huge fight. But obviously, if he goes to someone and says, oh, well, he may have printed it first, but I thought of it 10 years before he did. People are going to think, okay, yeah, sure you did. Why didn't you publish it until 40 years later? What sense does that make? So there was kind of this big argument about it. And what do we typically do with arguments that we can't solve on our own? We go to a higher authority. Well, the higher authority at the time, especially in the world of science, was the Royal Society. An anonymous reviewer hinted that Newton might have even borrowed Leibniz's ideas, which obviously made Newton furious. How dare you accuse me of stealing someone else's ideas for my method of fluxions and yada yada. So a fight broke out. Leibniz was actually somewhat reasonable, saying things like, I may have printed it first, but Newton, I'm sure, went way more in depth. He explained it probably way further than I did. Newton, however, was rude, saying, second inventors have no right whatsoever. Well, I mean, obviously I added whatsoever, but so anyway, Leibniz, I don't know if he agreed that Newton came up with it first, but either way, he seemed to be a lot more willing to work things out in a kind way, while Newton was just flat out, nope, you don't have any right because I actually thought of it first. So, like I said, in 1711, Leibniz appealed to the Royal Society to settle the issue. However, at the time, the president of the Royal Society put himself in charge of the committee that was looking into the issue. And who was the president? None other than Isaac Newton himself. That would be like saying, okay, my students and I are in a disagreement over something in the classroom, so we're going to go and ask the teacher. Okay, well, I am also the teacher, so that it just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's kind of lopsided. So, unfortunately, Newton twisted the evidence in the investigation to make it seem like Leibniz had actually stolen Newton's work. But no matter how that battle settled, it seemed like Newton probably made it work in his favor. In the long run, Leibniz actually won. And this is why. His system was much easier to understand. Calculus. Newton, who we know was a genius, he wrote his version of calculus in kind of an own personal shorthand. He used abbreviations and symbols and drawings that only he would understand. And he was incredibly intelligent, so most of his writing was way above the common person. Leibniz, however, his system was much easier to understand. Everyone who learns calculus today uses Leibniz's terms, symbols, and methods, not Newton's. Even the name calculus is from Leibniz, right? We don't call it method of fluxions, we call it calculus. So if Newton were alive today and knew about this, he would probably be furious. And finally, chapter 13, genius. Despite being so frail as a baby, Newton lived to be an old man. By his last years, he was wealthy, powerful, and respected. In 1705, he was actually knighted by Queen Anne, and he became Sir Isaac Newton. Okay, similar to what we saw with Francis Drake being knighted as well and becoming Sir Francis Drake. His mind remained sharp and his health mostly good up until the very end of his life. The book even mentions that he led a meeting of Parliament. No, he met a meeting of the Royal Society about a month before his death. He did die on March 20th, 1727 at age 85. He is the first scientist to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey is one of England's probably most prized buildings, one of the more famous ones there. It's where all of the coronations take place, royal weddings, etc. And they also buried important people there. I want to say that it used to be just for kings and queens and leaders of the church, etc. But over time, they began to honor politicians, poets, musicians, etc. And Newton actually became the first scientist, which was a huge honor to be buried in Westminster Abbey, that is. Now, what Newton accomplished was actually greater than his individual discoveries. Yes, he discovered gravity. Yes, he wrote the laws of motion. Yes, he did a lot of individually good things. But it was kind of as if other scholars who had also done good things had written interesting sentences, but Newton figured out the way all those sentences could be put together to tell the story of how the universe worked or works. Okay, so it's kind of like all these scientists made good points, but when Newton came along, he was able to kind of put the puzzle pieces together, link everything together to where it all made sense. So this is a picture of his tomb in Westminster Abbey, and this inscription is part of what I think is written down here below it. But it says, "Here is buried Isaac Newton, a knight, who by a strength of mind almost divine," right? His mind was almost like it was almost otherworldly or godlike, heavenly almost, "explored what no other scholar has previously imagined." So that wraps up our Isaac Newton study. Make sure that you have all of the packet filled out as well as the highlighted parts. And then don't forget that the test on Friday will be over Newton and Galileo together.